January 16, 1920, the United States of America makes it illegal to manufacture, transport, or sell alcohol. Every brewery, every distillery, every winery, every saloon in the country shuts down by order of federal law. It is the most ambitious attempt at social engineering in the history of democratic government, backed by decades of moral campaigning, ratified by 3/4 of American states, and supported by a genuine majority of the voting public. And within 18 months, a 30-year-old bookkeeper from Brooklyn named Arnold Rothstein has quietly become the most powerful criminal financier in the country, not by robbing banks or running cons, but simply by continuing to sell people something they want. By 1925, organized crime in the United States generates an estimated $3 billion a year in revenue. That is more than the entire federal government's annual budget. The government banned alcohol. What it actually created was the first modern corporation, the first national criminal network, and the infrastructure of organized crime that is still running today. How does a democracy vote itself into a criminal economy? And why does the pattern of prohibition, where the attempt to eliminate a market instead transforms and concentrates it, keep appearing in every era and every country that tries it? This is the story of American prohibition. By the end, you will understand the economic mechanism that turns suppressed markets into criminal empires. See how that mechanism is operating right now in industries you interact with every day, and recognize exactly why the people who benefit most from prohibition are almost never the people who wanted it. It is the summer of 1919. America is coming home from a war. The men filing off the troop ships in New York and Baltimore and New Orleans are different from the men who left. They have seen things. They have watched friends die in French mud for reasons that nobody can explain cleanly anymore. They have been to Paris, where the wine flows freely and the moral architecture of American evangelical Christianity seems very far away. And they have come back changed in ways they cannot always articulate. The cities they return to are loud and fast and electric with a new kind of energy, jazz spilling out of clubs in Harlem. Immigrant neighborhoods packed tight with families from Poland and Italy and Ireland, who have been drinking wine and beer as a cultural practice since before America existed as a country. The country is prosperous and restless and genuinely uncertain about what kind of place it wants to be. The temperance movement that produces prohibition is not a fringe phenomenon. It has been building for 80 years, driven by a coalition of Protestant churches, women's suffrage organizations, progressive reformers, and rural communities that have real and legitimate grievances about the damage that alcohol causes to working-class families. The saloon culture of industrial America is brutal. Men drink away wages their families need. Saloons serve as political patronage machines controlled by ward bosses. The Anti-Saloon League, which spends 30 years lobbying for prohibition, is one of the most effective political organizations in American history, operating across congressional districts with a sophistication that modern political action committees still study. The people who want prohibition are not stupid or ignorant. They have real evidence for the harm that unrestricted alcohol access produces. They are simply wrong about what prohibition will do about it. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in January 1919 and enforced through the Volstead Act beginning in January 1920, makes it a federal crime to manufacture, sell, or transport intoxicating liquors. It does not make it a crime to drink them. That distinction, almost comical in retrospect, is the first crack in the legal architecture of the whole enterprise, because it means that demand is not just tolerated but legally protected. Americans can want alcohol all they like. They simply cannot buy it legally. Into this gap between legal demand and illegal supply flows the most significant transfer of market power in the history of American business. The alcohol industry, before prohibition, is large, legitimate, competitive, and heavily taxed. In 1919, federal taxes on alcohol account for roughly 30% of all federal tax revenue. The industry employs hundreds of thousands of people, supports grain farmers across the Midwest, and generates supply chains that run from barley fields in Montana to glass factories in Ohio, to retail establishments in every city and town in the country. When prohibition arrives, all of that goes dark overnight. The people who ran the legal industry mostly try to pivot into legal businesses. The brewers shift to near beer and malt syrup. The distilleries convert to industrial alcohol. The bar owners become soda fountains and lunch counters. The market does not go with them. The market goes underground. Meet Wayne Wheeler. He is the general counsel and chief lobbyist of the Anti-Saloon League, and he is probably the most powerful unelected political operative in American history. He coins the term pressure politics and practices it with a ruthlessness that even his admirers find alarming. He personally writes large sections of the Volstead Act. He controls which congressional candidates receive the League's support in 40 states. When Prohibition passes, he celebrates it as the culmination of a lifetime of work. He genuinely believes that the elimination of legal alcohol will eliminate the human desire for it. He does not understand markets. He has never needed to. But Izzy Einstein understands markets, in his own way. He is a short, rotund postal worker from the Lower East Side of Manhattan who volunteers in 1920 to become a federal prohibition agent because he thinks he can actually enforce the law. Einstein is a genius at disguise and infiltration, and he personally raids more than 3,000 illegal drinking establishments over 5 years, often in costume, often with his partner Mo Smith, often generating newspaper headlines that made Prohibition seem almost playful. He finds illegal liquor in every city he visits, usually within minutes of arriving. In New Orleans, he finds it in 35 seconds. In Atlanta, he buys a drink from a policeman. He is one of the most effective enforcement agents the government has, and his career demonstrates with perfect clarity the impossibility of the task. There are not enough Izzy Einsteins, there will never be enough. And then there is Al Capone. Though in 1919 he is not yet Al Capone in the way that history knows him. He is a 20-year-old bartender and minor thug from Brooklyn, working for a gangster named Frankie Yale with a scar on his left cheek that he claims he got in the war, which is a lie. He is quick, ruthless, and possessed of a business mind that would have made him successful in any industry. Prohibition is not his idea. He does not lobby for it or plan around it. He simply looks at the situation as it develops, and sees the same thing that every competent criminal in America sees in January 1920. The largest consumer market in the country has just been handed to whoever is willing to serve it outside the law. What none of them know yet is that the crusade to eliminate the alcohol trade will instead perfect it, the mechanism that transforms Prohibition from a moral reform into a criminal business revolution operates through basic economic logic, but at a speed and scale that nobody anticipates. When a legal market is suppressed, the demand does not disappear. It persists, but it loses its price anchor. In a legal market, alcohol prices are constrained by competition. 1,000 breweries competing for the same customers cannot charge much more than their costs plus a reasonable margin. In an illegal market, the price floor rises by exactly the amount of risk required to produce and distribute the product. The risk premium is enormous. Illicit whiskey that cost 25 cents a bottle to produce in 1919 sells for $3 or $4 in a speakeasy in 1922. That markup does not go to a diffuse competitive market. It flows to whoever controls the supply chain, which means whoever can enforce their control with violence, which means organized crime. The speed of the criminal market's development is the thing that stuns contemporaries and still staggers historians. Within a year of Prohibition taking effect, every major American city has a functioning underground alcohol economy, and within 3 years, most of them have 2 or 3 competing criminal organizations fighting over market share. Chicago by 1923 has the Torrio Capone organization on the south side, the North Side Gang under Dion O'Banion, and a half-dozen smaller operations in between. New York has the Five Families taking shape, along with Arnold Rothstein's financing operation that provides capital to bootleggers, the way a bank provides capital to legitimate businesses. The criminal organizations are not primitive, they are innovative. They develop distribution networks that look remarkably like the logistics systems that legitimate businesses will spend decades perfecting. Rothstein, who will be shot to death in 1928 before seeing where his innovations lead, essentially invents the concept of wholesale criminal distribution, buying liquor in bulk, cutting it, and distributing it to retail bootleggers who serve end consumers. He does not get his hands dirty. He finances the chain and takes a percentage. It is a franchise model, developed in the 1920s for an illegal product. The violence that accompanies this market development is not incidental to the economic story. It is the market's enforcement mechanism. In a legal business, contracts are enforced by courts. A supplier who fails to deliver can be sued. A competitor who undercuts your prices illegally can be reported to regulators. In an illegal business, the only contract enforcement available is violence or the credible threat of it. The gang wars that consume Chicago and New York and Detroit through the 1920s are not criminal pathology. They are market competition conducted by the only means available. When the North Side and South Side gangs fight over a neighborhood's bootlegging territory, They are doing what Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel did in the 1880s, competing for monopoly control of a market, except that the competitive tool is a Thompson submachine gun rather than a predatory pricing strategy. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of February 1929, in which 7 members of the North Side Gang are shot in a garage on Clark Street, is a business decision. Capone is not crazy. He is consolidating market share. The enforcement side of this story is perhaps the darkest economic dimension of Prohibition, because it demonstrates how completely a suppressed market corrupts the institutions assigned to control it. The Volstead Act creates a federal prohibition bureau with approximately 1,500 agents to enforce alcohol laws across 3.8 million square miles of country. The agents are underpaid, undertrained, and operating against a criminal industry that by 1925 is generating more annual revenue than the entire federal government spends. The corruption is not exceptional. It is structural. A Chicago police captain in 1924 earns about $2,500 a year. A bootlegging operation pays him $75 a week, in cash, to look the other way. That is 3 times his salary for doing nothing illegal himself, just choosing not to notice what is happening on his beat. By 1928, the Chicago Police Department is so thoroughly penetrated by Capone's organization that the department's own records are being used to tip off bootleggers before raids. This is not a failure of individual character. It is the predictable result of paying public servants poverty wages to enforce a law that half the public does not want, enforced against an industry that can afford to make no enforcement extremely attractive. The speakeasy becomes the cultural symbol of Prohibition. And it is worth dwelling on what a speakeasy actually is, economically. It is a retail alcohol establishment operating in violation of federal law. And by 1927 there are an estimated 30,000 of them in New York City alone. That is twice the number of legal bars and saloons that existed before Prohibition. The suppressed market has not just persisted, it has grown. New York's police commissioner in 1927 estimates that half his force is on the bootleggers' payroll. Federal prohibition agents raid speakeasies at a pace that would require 30 years to work through the backlog if the number of establishments stayed constant, which it does not. For every speakeasy closed to open, the market is self-replicating because the profit margins are extraordinary and the population willing to take the risk. Having seen what the risk actually looks like in practice, which is usually a fine and a brief closure, is very large. The peak of this system, the moment of maximum absurdity, arrives in 1928, when the Republican Party nominates Herbert Hoover for president on a platform that includes vigorous enforcement of prohibition, and Hoover wins 58% of the popular vote. Capone is at the height of his power. His organization earns an estimated $60 million a year in revenue, of which perhaps $75 million goes to bribery, an accounting error that tells you something about the scale of the corruption budget. Federal Prohibition Commissioner Roy Haynes declares in 1928 that the bootlegger is on the run and that prohibition is working. He says this with, apparently, complete sincerity. The criminal economy of the United States is running at full capacity. Nobody in authority will say so out loud. This is the top. Nobody knows it yet. Then the stock market crashes in October 1929, and the entire economic and political landscape of prohibition shifts in a way that nobody had predicted. The crash and the depression that follows changed the argument about prohibition from a moral debate to an economic one. Federal tax revenue collapses by 60% between 1930 and 1932. The government needs new revenue sources urgently, and the most obvious one is sitting right in front of them. Legalizing and taxing alcohol would not just generate revenue, it would destroy the criminal enterprises that Prohibition has built, restore employment to a decimated workforce, and redirect billions of dollars from criminal organizations into the legitimate economy. By 1932, even many of Prohibition's original supporters have shifted their position. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had championed the 18th Amendment, is losing members. The American Bar Association formally endorses repeal. Franklin Roosevelt runs on repeal in 1932 and wins 42 states. The 21st Amendment, repealing Prohibition, is ratified on December 5, 1933, the fastest ratification of a constitutional amendment in American history. But here is what repeal does not do. It does not dismantle the criminal infrastructure that Prohibition built. It does not liquidate the distribution networks, the corrupt political relationships, the organizational structures that 13 years of illegal market operation have created and refined. The bootleggers pivot. Some go legitimate, obtaining liquor licenses and converting their speakeasies into legal bars. Some shift their operations to other illegal markets, gambling and loan sharking and narcotics, bringing to those markets the organizational sophistication and the political protection they developed in the alcohol trade. Lucky Luciano, who reorganized the New York underworld in the early 1930s, takes the corporate model that Rothstein pioneered and applies it to every criminal market simultaneously. Meyer Lansky, Luciano's financial partner, develops money laundering techniques for moving criminal proceeds into legitimate businesses that are still used by criminal organizations worldwide. Capone himself goes to Alcatraz, convicted not of bootlegging or murder but of tax evasion, the one accounting error the government could prove. His organization survives him. The outfit in Chicago operates, in various forms, for another 50 years. The 75,000 people who lose their jobs when Prohibition ends are not the bootleggers. They are the barrel makers and the malt syrup distributors and the near-beer brewers who had found legal niches in the suppressed economy. Their disruption is real and mostly invisible in the historical record. And still nobody asked the real question. So what does the conventional story say about Prohibition? It says that well-meaning moral reformers passed a law that turned out to be unenforceable, that it was repealed when it became obvious that it was not working, and that the lesson is that you cannot legislate morality. That story is true as far as it goes and stops precisely where it gets interesting. What actually happened is that Prohibition did not fail to change behavior. It succeeded in changing it, just not in the direction its architects intended. It eliminated a legal, competitive, taxed, regulated market and replaced it with an illegal, concentrated, untaxed, unregulated one. The product itself did not go away. The institutions around it were completely transformed, and the institutions that replaced the legal alcohol market were specifically optimized for one thing that legal markets are not: operating in the presence of official suppression. They had to be fast, flexible, violent when necessary, and deeply embedded in the political system they were nominally violating. Those capabilities did not disappear when Prohibition ended. They transferred. The mechanism runs like this. Suppress a market with persistent consumer demand. The demand does not disappear, it goes underground. Underground markets cannot use legal mechanisms for contract enforcement, quality control, or market expansion, so they substitute violence, reputation, and corruption. The organizations that survive this environment are specifically selected for ruthlessness, organizational sophistication, and the ability to corrupt official institutions. The profits available in a suppressed market, because the risk premium drives prices far above competitive levels, are large enough to fund this selection process generously. The result is an industry that is more concentrated, more violent, more politically connected, and more durable than the legal market it replaced. Every single time. The new paradigm for Prohibition-era thinking was the belief that consumer behavior could be permanently altered by removing legal supply, that the moral case for temperance was also a practical blueprint for achieving it. The easy money was the federal government's willingness to impose a policy whose enforcement costs it could not realistically bear, funded by a moral consensus that frayed almost immediately when enforcement realities became clear. The social proof was the genuinely successful political campaign by the Anti-Saloon League, which made Prohibition seem not just achievable but inevitable to the generation that passed it. The complexity was the Volstead Act itself, a legal document so riddled with exceptions for medicinal and sacramental uses, that it created immediate arbitrage opportunities that criminals exploited within days of the law taking effect. The peak euphoria is 1928, Herbert Hoover, 58% of the vote, and a Prohibition commissioner telling the press the bootlegger is on the run. The trigger is the Depression, which made the economic cost of the policy impossible to ignore, and the blame game is still running. Prohibition's supporters in the 1930s did not say the policy was wrong, they said it was not enforced vigorously enough. Once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. Now look at 2025. Because the suppressed market mechanism is not a historical artifact, it is active right now in every country that maintains prohibitions on substances with persistent consumer demand. The global illegal drug market is estimated at between $500 billion and $1 trillion annually, a number that is impossible to verify precisely but whose order of magnitude is not seriously disputed. The United States alone spends approximately $50 billion a year on drug law enforcement, in addition to the costs of incarceration, public health consequences, and the corruption of law enforcement and judicial institutions in producing countries and transit corridors. The drugs themselves are not more expensive because of enforcement. They are more profitable because of it. A kilogram of cocaine that costs roughly $1,500 to produce in Colombia sells for between $25,000 and $40,000 at the retail level in the United States. That 95% margin is not a sign of a successful product. It is the risk premium of a successfully suppressed market, and it flows to whoever can absorb that risk, which is organized criminal enterprises with the violence and corruption capabilities to do so. Run through the checklist. New paradigm. The current version in drug policy is the belief, genuinely held by many serious people, that criminalization reduces use enough to justify its costs, that the alternative of regulated legal markets would produce unacceptably higher consumption. That argument is empirically testable, and the testing has not been kind to the prohibition side. Portugal decriminalized personal possession of all drugs in 2001 and has seen drug-related deaths, HIV infections, and incarceration rates fall significantly over the 20 years since. Oregon's partial experiment with decriminalization produced mixed results, suggesting that decriminalization alone without accompanying treatment infrastructure is insufficient, which is a different problem from the one prohibition is designed to solve. Easy money. The profit margins available in illegal drug markets fund criminal enterprises at a scale that makes law enforcement investment look trivially small. The Sinaloa cartel's estimated annual revenue of $3 billion is not a sign of market failure. It is the natural result of risk premium pricing in a suppressed market with extremely inelastic demand. Social proof. 58% of Americans now support marijuana legalization, a number that was 12% in 1969. The shift in that number over 50 years is itself a demonstration of how slowly the social proof mechanism operates when the institutional interests supporting prohibition are durable. Complexity. The international architecture of drug prohibition, built through a series of unconventions, beginning in 1961, creates legal constraints on national policy that make reform difficult even in countries whose domestic political consensus has shifted. Peak euphoria. Drug prohibition reached its institutional peak in the 1980s during the Reagan administration's war on drugs, a period of genuinely ambitious enforcement that produced no sustained reduction in supply or demand and generated a prison population that grew by 300% in 20 years. What is genuinely different now? The regulatory and public health infrastructure available in 2025 is substantially more sophisticated than what existed in 1920. Legal marijuana markets in 24 American states have demonstrated that regulated legal markets can undercut illegal ones on price while generating tax revenue and maintaining quality control. The fentanyl crisis, which has killed more Americans annually than Prohibition-era alcohol poisoning ever did, is substantially a product of the same mechanism that produced poisoned moonshine in the 1920s. When legal supply is suppressed, producers in illegal markets have no regulatory check on product safety and every incentive to increase potency to reduce shipping volume. That is not an argument for or against any particular policy. It is a description of the mechanism. Watch for any policy conversation in which the stated goal is to eliminate consumer behavior through supply suppression alone, without addressing demand. Watch for enforcement regimes where the cost of suppression exceeds the tax revenue that legalization would generate, because that arithmetic tells you something about who actually benefits from the status quo. And watch for the gap between what prohibition's advocates say will happen and what the historical evidence says actually happens, because that gap has been consistent across substances, countries, and centuries. And it keeps appearing because the people who advocate for prohibition are usually responding to the real harm that unregulated markets and certain substances produce, and they are right about that harm, and wrong about the cure. So why do we keep doing this? Why does every generation produce a version of Wayne Wheeler, an earnest, effective, strategically brilliant advocate for a policy that will make the problem it is trying to solve significantly worse? The answer is not stupidity, and it is not cynicism, though both appear in the story. The answer is that the harm that drives prohibition advocacy is real and visible. The dead father, the destroyed family, the neighborhood consumed by alcoholism or addiction. These harms are immediate, personal, and emotionally legible. The countervailing harm, the criminal empire that suppression creates, the corrupted institutions, the contaminated products, the concentrated violence, accumulates slowly, diffusely, and in neighborhoods that are often not the ones where the advocates live. You can see the drunk at the end of the bar, You cannot see the organizational chart of the Sinaloa cartel. Both are products of the same set of policy choices. Only one of them shows up in the moral arithmetic of the reformer. The crash of prohibition into repeal is not the end of this story. It is a chapter in a story that keeps running because the underlying human instinct, that the right response to a harmful behavior is to make it illegal, is not going away. It will not go away because it is not entirely wrong. Some prohibitions work. Murder is prohibited and the prohibition reduces murder. Fraud is prohibited and the prohibition reduces fraud. The question that the alcohol and drug experience raises is not whether prohibition is ever the right tool, but under what conditions it produces the intended result and under what conditions it does the opposite, and whether there is an honest willingness to look at the evidence and update the policy when the evidence is clear. That willingness has historically been in short supply, because the political cost of admitting that a moral crusade produced organized crime is very high, and the people who built the crusade would rather extend it than acknowledge it. You cannot personally undo the architecture of criminal enterprise that 13 years of American prohibition built. You cannot individually reform drug policy, but you can resist the framing that presents supply suppression as a neutral or obvious response to harmful markets, and you can ask, when the next version of this argument appears in whatever domain it arrives in, whether the mechanism of the proposed solution matches the history of how similar solutions have actually worked. The evidence is not hidden. Izzy Einstein found illegal liquor in New Orleans in 35 seconds in 1920. The question is not whether suppressed markets persist. The question is what we are willing to learn from the fact that they do. Now I want to hear what you think. What market today do you believe is being shaped by the same suppressed market mechanics that prohibition created? And what would you actually need to see in the evidence before you would change your position on a prohibition-style policy you currently support? That second question is harder than the first, and the answer to it is more important. Drop it in the comments. If this changed how you read the next news story about a drug bust or a criminal network or a vice squad raid, hit the like button and subscribe. Next time, we are going inside the moment when the United States government accidentally created the conditions for the greatest peacetime economic expansion in history, and then spent 40 years arguing about whether it had done the right thing. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, it is rhyming loud. See you in the next one.